Hi, Boulder Bookstore. It's Johanna Garton, and I'm so happy to be here today to answer a few questions about Edge of the Map, which is my brand new book that was published just a couple months ago. And I'm so happy that Boulder Bookstore is carrying it now. And I'm happy to be here today to answer some questions about it. So, Edge of the Map is an adventure story. It's been called a biography, but it's really much more than a biography. If you've read Into Thin Air, you will definitely love Edge of the Map. It's an adventure story, creative nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, some people call it, and it's based on the life of Christine Boscoff, who was, I feel, America's finest high altitude mountain climber, female version. And she is the only American woman to have summited six of the world's 8,000-meter peaks. So it puts her in the same category as Ed Viesturs. Chris and her climbing partner, Charlie Fowler, who many of you may remember because he spent many years in Boulder, died in the year 2006 in an avalanche in western China. And it was a pretty dramatic search and rescue to find them. Ultimately, they were discovered to have been killed by an avalanche. And so the book is about Chris's life, but it's also the story of this disappearance and the search and rescue, which eventually became a search and recovery effort. So I've got a few questions that were sent to me by Boulder Bookstore that I'm happy to answer. So, first question, is Chris looked up to by today's climbers as a female pioneer, and are today's climbers aware of her legacy? And that's fascinating because it's one of the reasons I decided to write the book. She was incredibly humble, and very few people at the time she was climbing really knew what she was accomplishing. She was climbing in the late 90s and early 2000s, which was around the time that Ed Viesturs was making his attempt to climb all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks. And she was very under the radar as opposed to a lot of the men in the sport. So I would say, as people read about her, she is being looked up to much more now, but that was definitely one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book, because I think her legacy lives on in many ways that were very quiet, and I'm happy for her to have her moment in the spotlight now. So, did she have some unique challenges as a woman, and what hurdles did sexism present to her? So, yes, she did. She did. But again, because she was so humble, those were things she never focused on. She never wanted her gender to define her. She never wanted people to focus on the fact that she was a woman. She and her husband, Keith Boscoff, had bought Mountain Madness, which is the guiding company in Seattle that had been owned by Scott Fisher prior to his death on Everest in 1996. And when her life with Keith went in different directions, and I don't want to give too much away there, but eventually Chris became the sole owner of Mountain Madness, and she was the only woman at that time to be a woman running a major guiding business. So, both in the business world and in her sport, she was doing just trailblazing work. And she definitely did face some sexism, but again, if you read through the interviews at that time, she rarely focused on that and very much tried to downplay that so people would focus on her accomplishments and not her gender. A writing question: how do you maintain tension in nonfiction narrative when the reader knows from the outset the tragic ending of the story? So this is really interesting. People come to the book knowing that Chris and Charlie will die at the end of the book. But the story of their disappearance and the search and rescue efforts and how frantic it was and how it involved this Telluride contingent, which is where Charlie and Chris lived, and this Seattle contingent, which is where Mountain Madness was headquartered, how those contingents came together and integrated with Chinese authorities and American authorities, and how stress filled those days were, was a story that really hadn't been told, not in its fullest. So I'm finding lots of readers getting to me saying, I got to about chapter 15 and then I stayed up all night long because I couldn't stop reading. Because it does become kind of a page turner at the end, even though you know what's going to happen. So I didn't have a problem with that because there were so many Really fascinating and heart-rending details at the end of the story. Let's see. Oh, here's a good one. How much research and what kind of research did you do to write this book? So, quite a bit. My mother had started the research for this book and wanted to write this book because Chris and I are from the same hometown. We're both from Appleton, Wisconsin, and I live in Denver. And Chris, at the time of her death, was living in Telluride. But I'm not a mountain climber. And so I didn't know her story. I didn't know her. She was 3 years older than me, and we had never met, amazingly, being from this small town in the Midwest. And my mother heard about her disappearance and became fascinated by her story. And mom is also a journalist and wanted to write the story, so had worked on it for many years. Eventually, she had to stop working on it because she contracted Parkinson's disease. And at that time, I had just finished my first book and I was looking for a second project, and I offered to help her finish the book. So that's kind of the backstory as to how I got the story and how the book landed in my lap. Once I was given all of my mother's research, I then spent about a year and a half going over the research and then calling and talking to probably 75 people, many mountaineers, many preeminent mountaineers. Willie Benegas was really very helpful. Conrad Anker and Jenny Lowe Anker. I spoke with both of them, many mountaineers in Telluride and in Boulder. And then I also traveled to Telluride. I spent several trips back and forth to Seattle. And then eventually I actually did go to the mountain in Western China where Chris and Charlie died in the avalanche. So it was quite a bit of research and really a labor of love because of the fact that my mother had started the story. So, and then the last question was what inspired me to want to tell the story? I think I just kind of covered that now. So there's also one request to read a passage from the book, which I'm happy to do. I think I will read just a really short passage, which is Chris's summit of Everest. She summited in the year 2000, and she was attempting Everest with Peter Hobler, who was one of the first to summit Everest without oxygen. He and Reinhold Messner had done that many, many years before, and he was back on Everest to summit again with Chris. Eventually, he was not able to summit, and Chris did, but prior to her summit, she was very much struggling because she wanted to summit without oxygen. And so this is that passage. She's with her lead Sherpa, whose name is Kili Sherpa. Chris, you should use oxygen, Kili said as they lay in their tent. We're at South Col. You need it now. I don't want it, she said. Even if I did, I don't have a tank. Kili nodded, pulling his mask off and holding it out to her. Her blue eyes looked tired, her voice weak. The space between them felt strained by the disagreement. Yes, I know, he said. You can use mine. If you're beaten up by the altitude, it's a big problem here. Even myself, strong Sherpa, I get very tired. She balked at the idea. I really wanted to do this without O's, Kili. I did, and Peter did too. You've come to climb Everest, Chris. You're strong, stronger than me, but if you get sick... Kili couldn't begin to think about her falling ill on his watch. They stared at each other, neither budging until Chris spoke. Just to get through the night? Yes, just that, he said. She reached for the mask in silence as Kili adjusted the dial on the regulator. Placing it over her mouth and nose, she inhaled, closing her eyes. Oxygen poured into her body, precious and life-sustaining. As she drew in 3 more breaths, her body softened into the sleeping bag. She removed the mask and handed it to Kili, who took 3 breaths of his own. Taking turns with the mask, the two gradually fell into hypoxic sleep. So that's one of my favorite passages. So I hope you pick up the book. It's really wonderful. It was a wonderful journey. I think I'm very honored to be entering the genre of mountaineering narratives. There are very few books written by women in that particular genre. So I think this book is unique in that it has humility and depth, which I think sometimes can be missing in other mountaineering narratives. And it's appealing to everybody. It's got this really large fan base of women who are over the age of 60 who aren't climbers. So it's definitely a book that I wrote for non-climbers. I think it's appealing to mountaineers and climbers, obviously, but it's really tailored for all of us who are just fascinated by life in the mountains and the sport of mountaineering. So I hope you pick it up. There was one more question about what I'm reading right now, and this is what I'm finishing right now, which is the biography of Samantha Power, which is just fascinating. I'm really loving it. And I've got a stack a mile high, but I'll keep that for another day. Thanks so much, Boulder Bookstore.